Alex de Tocqueville.
So, 19th century French thinker. I mean, we usually teach de Tocqueville in American political thought courses, but he's actually French, and in many ways his concerns were very French. So, I mean, his primary work, his masterwork, is the 2-volume Democracy in America, which he wrote after having a kind of extended stay and extended tour of America. And so there's a lot of great stuff in there. There's a lot of great stuff about American associational life, the way that Americans, they practice a unique form of democratic liberty in that they're organized in these small towns, but the small towns themselves are really, in some sense, they're communities, and they're active communities. So if they need a bridge built, if they need a church built, or whatever it happens to be, they get together, they say, we're all there are. We are the people that are capable of doing this. There's no one coming to help us. We can't apply for a blockade grant or something like that.
Right.
We want to build a church, we're going to do it. And so they build up what Robert Putnam would later call a form of social capital. And they lived free in that sense. And Tocqueville is very enthusiastic about this, about the way that Americans organize in this way. But for the most part, what democracy in America is it's a kind of the way I see it is it's kind of a long meditation on what you might call the fact of democracy. So de Tocqueville himself had a kind of aristocratic background. His concerns, you might say, were aristocratic in nature. He was interested in some sense, diagnosing and coming to understand this great new sweep, this kind of this torrent. I think in the opening he compares it to a kind of a river that's flowing through the West. Right, that all these old aristocracies, this old way of living, this is being sort of washed away, and in its place is coming this new thing, democracy, by which he means, egalitarianism. He means a number of different things, and so he's just got all these interesting chapters on the effect of democracy on things like on marriage, on family size. There's a chapter on the effect that democracy and democratic norms have on the size of headstones for when people die and things like that. So in other words, for him,
how big should they be in a functioning democracy?
Exactly, how big they'll be,
yeah.
And all this thing. So for him, in many ways, it's a kind of a sociological critique of what democracy is going to mean for our political institutions, what it's going to mean for individual liberty, what it's going to mean for some. I think really what he's worried about is some sense of national greatness, in other words. And for him, the Americans did it right, and he worries very much that the French did it incorrectly, they did it wrongly, and that they're going to pay for it down the line.
Yeah. Do you think that if he was here today, he might think that America has actually started to do it wrong?
Yeah,
because when you talk about liberty and things of that nature, it does seem like we might be going more of the French route in certain respects.
Yeah, so in the second book in particular, he has a lot of talk about what he calls soft despotism. And soft despotism is something that that worried him, that he thought would be a kind of something that was uniquely well suited to a democratic country. And so the basic idea of soft despotism is like, listen, is a democracy going to accept some a tyrant who comes in and makes them work long hours and does all this kind of stuff? No, they're not going to accept that. They're not going to accept a kind of traditional form of tyrant who just enriches themselves at the public expense and all this kind of stuff. What they're going to accept is a soft despot, a despot who comes in and says, listen, you don't need to to build your own bridges, for example. You don't need to provide for the poor in your own communities. I'll do all this stuff for you, right? We can just kind of centralize this sort of thing. I'll take care of it. It's much more efficient if I do it anyway. I'll take a lot of this kind of responsibility off your hands. And for Tocqueville, he worried that this would have a kind of innervating effect on people, that instead of going out and building that bridge or building that that church or whatever it happens to be, instead of going out interacting with each other in communities, building up trust, solving problems together in a local way, that we would instead, if we want to build a bridge, we might come together long enough to fill out an application for federal grade and then send it off.
Right, so basically we'd outsource the very things that make us a community, sort of.
That's a really good way of putting it, actually. Yeah. So that I think is his fear, is that we've abdicated basically these powers, the powers of self-government. We've said, listen, we're tired of governing ourselves in some sense. Some of these decisions are great responsibilities. Some of these decisions we don't particularly like anyway. We don't like making, and so we'll just sort of hand them over and live in a softer and more comfortable sort of way.
Yeah. For the people watching that would say, well, what's the problem with that? Why is that a problem?
Well, I mean,
what's the problem?
Right. I mean, there's a sense in it's an active question. I mean, that is an open question, I think. Right. So it's an open question in terms. So today, we've got these amazing TVs, and we've got these amazing video games, and we've got these amazing everything. And there is a certain sense in which, listen, if what we are building in the future is this kind of what we in philosophy would call a kind of a hedon machine, right? So we just kind of plug ourselves into a pleasure machine. What's wrong with the pleasure machine? Like, what's wrong with just being happy all the time? Mm-hmm. Particularly if these more sort of rugged individualist kind of decisions, if these responsibilities are in some sense unhappy responsibilities. I don't want to have to build this bridge if I got other things I want to do. Right. I've got a job. I got kids, I've got video games, I want to watch the NBA, whatever it is I want to do, I don't want to go out and build this bridge. So in other words, what's wrong with just being as happy as we can be? And if happiness means, in the way you phrased it, outsourcing these responsibilities, then what's wrong with that?
Well, I did see WALL-E, the Disney movie WALL-E, and I know if you outsource all those things, you become just basically a fat blob, right. Drinking soda and whatever. Did you do research on me? Because you've mentioned video games and basketball now, and I think you're just looking over here.
Actually, in the dressing room, there was an old school NES sitting on top of a PS4.
How are your skills, by the way?
On the NES?
Yeah.
They're pretty good, actually. Well, it depends on the game. Sports games, I can do sports games.
All right, we got 15 minutes of baseball. After this, maybe we'll stream it for the people. All right, we touched on this guy already, but I think this is probably the person that I think is most confused in modern discussion, Karl Marx. Yeah. When people talk about Marxism, I feel like they have no idea what they're talking about, and especially, as you've mentioned, conversation on Twitter can often be crazy. You see this, people calling each other Marxists and Marxists. They have no idea what they're saying. So let's go back to that a little bit.
Yeah. So it's a huge topic. I mean, you could spend your entire academic career, or your entire life going through Marxist thought. I mean, it's contained in these huge volumes. So Capital, his great work, that was only volume 1 of what became 3 volumes, which itself was only 1/8 of this kind of broader project that he thought he was working on.
So you're saying you can't get that all out in one tweet?
Yeah, that's right. Well, there are days when I wish that Marx would have just had Twitter, actually, which he said, listen, I have 3,000 pages, but I can break it down into one thread on Twitter.
Yeah.
And that's just one work. I mean, he's unbelievably productive, remarkably productive over the course of his life. Now, we bandy about the term Marx today in strange ways. So, I mean, somebody like Bernie Sanders, right? People are talking about democratic socialism. We love throwing out these polls to millennials and saying, do you like capitalism, do you like socialism? And then we act surprised when they say socialism. Yeah. Well, if their interaction with socialism is something like what Bernie Sanders is offering, there's nothing terribly socialistic or Marxist about what Bernie is about. So, I mean, Bernie is a fairly old school redistributionist. Does Bernie Sanders want to destroy the state? No. Does Bernie Sanders want to destroy the institution of private property? No. Bernie Sanders just wants to, in many ways, actually wants to reinforce the state. He wants to use the state to redistribute wealth from those who have too much to those who have less.
Yeah. I think you can have all legit criticisms of that, but that's not destroying the state. That's an interesting distinction. It's not destroying the state. That's actually tightening the screws of the state.
No, I think there's a distinction that has to be made when we talk about the left and we use the capital L. We tend to conflate many different attitudes, political attitudes, economic attitudes. I mean, so in terms of textbook definitions, when we think of socialism, we think of public ownership of the means of production, so worker-owned factories, but also just industries being run in what we think of as the public service or something like that, or to public ends. And then full-scale communism is the complete abolition of private property. None of those things, I think, are really on the table. I mean, so I think in his younger days, Sanders talked about nationalizing banks or something like that. But, I mean, for the most part, it's pretty tame. I mean, if you look at Venezuela, you look at Chavez, you look at things like that. I mean, that's what socialism looks like. I mean, these people are more serious. Socialism with a capital S.
Yeah.
Bernie's just, I mean, he's peddling a kind of welfarism, whatever you want to call it.
But I always see people saying that you can't look at Venezuela because it doesn't give you the right example of socialism.
Yeah.
The socialists always say that because it didn't work out the way they wanted it to.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, 20th century is a pretty long advertisement against what we think of as. I mean, and a lot of that stuff has to be teased out. So, I mean, we have a very difficult time of separating what we may think as political or economic philosophy from the rise of the nation state, the development of large-scale states and all that kind of stuff. And these processes, they're absolutely intertwined, but they are distinct. So I think in Russia, I mean, a lot of what you had was going on there was absolutely this unbelievably pernicious application of Marxism in a variety of ways. And I think a lot of 20th century libertarian thought offers good arguments as to why socialism will always look like that. So in other words, this wasn't an accident, right? This is how it's always going to play out, and here are reasons for that. So if you look at Mises, if you look at Hayek, they make that case. And those are really good resources. But at the same time, I mean, the development of the nation state itself tends to be a fairly bloody process, particularly when we talk about processes of modernization and all this kind of stuff, whether it be, I mean, if we think about World War II, right, an unprecedentedly bloody conflict, unprecedentedly bloody event. Can we pin something like World War II on Marx? I don't think reasonably we can. What can we pin it on? I'm not really sure. I think a lot of these processes are sort of broader, mostly material world historical processes that came to that came to fruition in a particularly awful way. But when it comes to somebody like Marx, I mean, I think there's a number of things. So there's Marx the Economist. So Marx the Economist drew largely from classical economics. He read a lot of Smith. He read a ton of David Ricardo, James Mill, and all this kind of stuff. And he attempted to, in some sense, synthesize the great political economists. And he attempted to, I mean, the way that I like to think about what Marx was doing was he was attempting to describe, I mean, he would say dialectically. I want to say that he was attempting to describe the experience of living in a commercial or bourgeois society. And so for me, I think what's most interesting, I think the kind of work of Marx is that liberals should pay the most attention to, the classical liberals should pay the most attention to, is his thoughts on what it's like to live in a commercial society, on what it's like to work in a commercial society. When he talks about commodities, for example, and the ways that we tend to organize our life around commodities, the ways that we tend to commodify many things in our lives that maybe don't need to be, maybe that ought not to be commodified. Right? In other words, there's a kind of built into it, there's a kind of almost an existential critique of life within a modern capitalist society that I think, there's no reason, I think, for classical liberals to just say, oh, this is coming from Marx. Marx was the Marx of Marxism. Marxism is bad for these variety of reasons, therefore we'll just throw everything out together.
Right.
I think with Marx, I think we can actually get a lot of purchase, or we can begin to understand a lot of the cultural and artistic critiques of capitalism that we've been dealing with in the 20th and 21st centuries. Mm-hmm.
So basically, you don't have to buy the economic theories to understand the critique of just sort of the human philosophical tenets of it.
So take something like take something like Tinder, right?
He wrote a lot on Tinder, if I'm not
Tinder
mistaken.
the one? It's the swiping.
That's the swiping.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So let's take the swiping one. So there's a couple ways of looking at Tinder. So one way of looking at Tinder, you look at Tinder, you say, oh, this is awful. Or you say, there's something unnatural about this. There's something just really messed up about people swiping left or right, treating potential life partners essentially as, I mean, the way you would look at fresh produce in the supermarket, right? Like, oh, this one's bad, this one's good, whatever. I mean, there's something a little weird about that. And so you're put on the kind of a horns of dilemma. So you can either say, listen, there's nothing weird about that. Isn't it great that we can, that we can lower the opportunity cost of dating or something like that? Listen, and the fact that people are doing this suggests that it makes them happy, and who are you to say they shouldn't be happy and all that kind of thing? And we're often kind of thrown onto that side of it. Yeah. Just this kind of, whatever kind of commercial behavior people adopt is good just by virtue of them adopting it.
Yeah, that's that pleasure machine you mentioned.
That's right. And in other words, we don't have liberals lack a really strong footing to critique this kind of behavior. I mean, we don't want, anytime people critique other people's behaviors and practices, anytime other people begin to rank different ways of life, we begin to think things get a little thorny, and we want to shy away from that. And then the other side of the dilemma is saying, oh, there's something wrong about it. It objectifies members of the opposite sex, or I mean, depending on if you're, whoever it is you're shopping for, right? It objectifies them. It does, it trivializes these meaningful relationships. It does this and that, all that kind of stuff. And all that stuff, I think, is really powerful. People get that. I mean, when people hear that, it moves them in some sense. And I think we cut ourselves off to all of these methods of thinking about the way that we live now because we're so intent on keeping the economic side of things, because we're so intent essentially on denying that there's anything wrong at all with any of the behaviors and any of the practices that we've adopted in commercial society.
So we're basically afraid to judge because that would be against our sort of liberal position.
Right. I mean,
which then puts us on a pretty slippery slope.
I mean, this is a very old dispute within liberal thought, right? So it actually goes back to the question of toleration. So, I mean, conservatives have criticized liberals for a very long time, and precisely because they treat apathy as toleration, because they mistake indifference for toleration, right? You're not actually tolerant of different ways of life because you're completely and utterly unable or unwilling to judge different ways of life. Whereas I don't think liberals are really committed to that. I mean, using the coercive force of the state to enforce certain ways of life, I mean, that's one thing.
Right.
Right? But being able to have a conversation about what sort of practices you want to adopt, what sort of practices you think your children ought to adopt, these sorts of conversations, in other words, I mean, we set ourselves off from the kind of conversations about the nature of the good life that communities used to have. I mean, that people used to say, you know, listen, I think this way of life is better. I think this way of life is more meaningful. I think what you're doing here in this particular case is wrong. I think it you know, has these effects and all this kind of stuff. I mean, we really try to shy away from that as much as we can, and I'm not sure that we're always better off for it.